Hey there, my name is Rachael and welcome to the Magdala podcast. We at Magdala know from experience that pornography, masturbation, and other sexual addictions are not just a guy problem. The need for women to be accompanied in the journey towards healing from addiction has gone sorely unmet, and that's why we're here. Magdala exists as a space where women can find hope, healing, and freedom alongside each other from sexual addiction. Our goal is to supply you with support, community, and accountability. Here on the podcast, you'll find everything from testimonies to practical advice to dialogue about how to heal and live fully as a Catholic woman. Wherever you are in your journey, know that you're not alone, and we welcome you to this table. All right, welcome back to the Magdala podcast. I have an exciting guest today, Dr. Jo Malone, also known as the sexual integrity scientist. We'll get into that in a minute. But Dr. Jo, welcome to the Magdala podcast. Thanks for joining the conversation.
Thank you, Rachel. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, I'd love to just have our listeners know a little bit more about you. We got connected through a mutual friend and contact, but I know that's part of the story. But I would just love for you to kind of introduce your work, introduce how you got connected with Magdala, and yeah, where your work has taken you now.
Excellent. Yeah. It's been an amazing journey, very providential all the way along. I was working in the fitness industry, health industry, and had a reason to start teaching at one of the local universities here in the Nashville area where I live. And in that process, I'd been through some things in the fitness industry that were very tough and disillusioning. I had a couple of clients, people that I knew at least, that had heart attacks and died, and one of them I was literally giving chest compressions to, and he didn't make it. So that was a horrible experience to go through. About 20 minutes worth of trying to help him live. Mm-hmm. I got some intel on some research on my transition over to the university teaching on a master's about how girls and young women as they mature from like around puberty to the time they start having children, hopefully get married and start having children, the state of their bodies really makes a huge effect on their babies, on their future health. And we'd been frustrated in the fitness industry up to that point as far as having all these thousands of people coming at us and only be able to help them one at a time, and work with them like personal training, that type of thing. I saw in this, and God helped me see in this, the potential to work, exponentially with future generations. If you work with a young woman, prospectively, she's going to have at least 2, maybe 3 or 4 kids, hopefully. You affect her health, you affect the future health of the child, because her health literally influences to the largest degree how that child is creating itself inside the womb. It's mm-hmm. actually using her muscles, bone, and fat to create all of its organs, again, their kidneys, heart, brain, lungs, all of it off the quality of her muscles, bone, and fat. So if she's extremely fit and extremely healthy, then you're building in great organs and everything into the child. If she's either way underweight, like happens in the other parts of the world, the developing world, or if she's way overweight, like what happens here oftentimes in our country and other, so-called developed countries, if the baby's born very, very big, like over 11.5 pounds, then defects are built in as well. So I went to this university, MTSU, with the goal, to try to create this women's program eventually.
And a women's fitness program specifically?
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It was specifically the class I created was called Women's Personal Conditioning, and it ended up being very popular. 2/3 of the women that were taking personal conditioning, they had the choice the whole time of the standard, the co-ed version, or the one that I had created, and then 2/3 of them were choosing to do the women's personal conditioning. So I learned a lot in working with them for about 5 years, just teaching that class. But along the way, and somebody suggested, why don't you do a Ph.D. around that? And I said, that's a great idea. So I did. And in the process of studying for the dissertation for the Ph.D. and interviewing a bunch of them, 32 of them in-depth interviews, and then 10 focus groups with the classes, I learned that, nutrition was a challenge on campus, having time, in their busy lives to work out properly was a challenge. But this other thing that I had no idea was going on, hookup culture, was extremely destructive to them. They were extremely suffering from having this desire in most cases for a lasting relationship and something that may, turn into engagement and marriage, and just being able to get somebody to hook up with them, if anything at all. So I went to my committee and asked, can I change directions with this? Because, overall wellness is important for the reasons I came into it for. But the idea of these young women's sexual wellness, I could see was more important and, again, more potential to help them. And so they said, we don't know if anybody else is doing that. And so they said, yeah, you can do that. So I was writing a book, and the book changed from an overall young women's wellness book. Mostly it includes men too, but mostly for young women. It turned in from that into a 2/3, 3/4 of it is young women's sexual wellness. So I learned a great deal in the process of the research for that. And again, realized that, even though I didn't plan to come down this pathway, it was a pathway that God determined for me, that where I could do the most good. Now, along the way, again, I was raised evangelical, and along the way, I learned of the Catholic Church's teachings on human sexuality, basically, and the whole idea of against contraception. The only church that in 1930 that stood against contraception. Generally open to life, the procreative and unitive functions, of marriage. And what it turned out to be in my research, and I did the research first, the Catholic Church's policies, its catechism, its teachings are ideal for young women as far as what contributes to their health, not only in the time that they're young and getting married and having babies, but for their whole future reproductive chances of getting cancer, for one thing. And so it turns out that not using not using hormonal contraception is preventive of cancer. It turns out that having babies and having them earlier rather than later is preventive. Having more of them is preventive. Breastfeeding them is preventive. So, and things like breast cancer, which became the #1 cancer diagnosis in 2020 worldwide, surpassing lung cancer. Yeah. And again, one sex gets it for the most part. 99% of breast cancer victims are women. It's 100 times more than it used to be for various reasons, but one of the reasons is that people aren't living by the Catholic Church's teachings on human sexuality. So that's what drew me to the church in the beginning. And then there's a lot of other things that God's taught me since then, as far as maybe my Irish family background, my ancestry. We're heavy into the more than I ever realized. They're 800 years they served in a monastery. We have relatives, Malone relatives, that served in that monastery. So, and again, learned a lot about myself, and also young women and how important young women are. I came to the conclusion that young women are the key to the future, and the key to them in the future is sexual integrity, because sexual integrity by young women forces everything else to go in the right direction. It forces the men to go along with whatever the women are doing as far as the gatekeepers to sexuality. So I'll stop there. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. And I think I love that your journey, both in your career and then also personally in your own faith, was a matter of going from body to soul, right? Like, our sexuality is a deeper part of our embodiment, and it relates deeply to our soul. And I just love that the Lord took you kind of from the surface of your research deeper and deeper into how does the body relate to the person? How is it, what is the body's relationship to the soul? And sexuality is a huge part of that. I think I feel the same, weight of responsibility for women in sexual healing. We take that really seriously in Magdala. And I think the term gatekeepers is typically one we're against. I see what you're saying, because I think we'd agree. And I feel like I shared this quote with you in our first meeting that Fulton Sheen said, the level of any civilization is the level of its women, you know, and that we can measure the morality of society on how women are living morally. And I think that can be taken into a disordered context where we put too much moral responsibility on women and take it off of men. And men are supposed to exhibit a certain strength in leadership and morality and in all things. But then it's also, I think, a really beautiful call for women of you set a high standard, and there's a, just, you know, like if we think about in the Catholic faith, like the Blessed Mother is the pinnacle of sainthood, and that women have the chance to imitate that there's a level of holiness that is really unique to women and special to women, I think is a really beautiful call. And living out sexual integrity is a huge part of that. So your work is endlessly interesting to me. For our listeners, I told Dr. Joe beforehand, I was like, I think this is only like the first of a series of podcasts, because there's just so much to unpack there. But I know today we wanted to focus on just kind of an overview of the biochemistry of addiction, kind of how you saw addiction affecting the men and women you were working with. I know you're somewhat new to kind of the aspect of like pornography addiction for women, but a lot of your research, as you said, has applied pretty easily to the topic. So I'd love for us to just, do an overview of what the biochemistry of addiction looks like, what it does to the mind, the person. And yeah, I mean, wherever you'd like to begin, you definitely have far more research in this than I. So yeah, I'd love for you to give our listeners an overview.
Well, I would love to. I appreciate the opportunity. I will say, to qualify what I said earlier, as far as the gatekeepers go, the overall society has changed in a bad way, to the point where men are not expected to be chivalrous to women.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, they're ridiculed these days in
Absolutely.
a lot of cases if they are. So the expectations, the guardrails, I would call it guardrails, like a super highway you're on that keeps you from going off the highway when you're driving fast. They've been taken off, as far as conduct of young men, and then conduct of young women. And so it's one of those things where my advocation would be for both sexes to
Absolutely.
go back to those approaches, and for it not to be on all laid on the women's shoulders, but they have again, biochemically, and this is the thing that jumped out at me. Generally, biochemically, they're equipped better to literally to be more have more constraint when it comes to sexuality. And I think down the road with with other podcasts, we'll probably get into that. But seeing it from that angle, seeing the sex differences biologically, I can see how God set it up. And again, it's the society is all messed up, and both young men and both and young women are not doing the things that their sexual natures would ask them to do. So, and what's good for them. So, but I'll leave that there for a future conversation.
Yes, absolutely.
Just as an explanation of how I come to the the way I look at it, I guess.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that qualification. That sounds good.
Yeah, no, I'd be the last one to make young women, after working with them so long, make them think they're completely responsible for everything in society.
Absolutely, but
they are strong. Young women generally are strong when it comes to sex. I always say young women are the stronger sex between the two. They're better equipped. But getting to the porn situation, and you're right. This is something that I initially started studying heavily based on the male situation with it, because of the brain biochemical and structural differences between the two sexes. But I'm realizing more and more, Rachel, that women are, in the olden days, in societies from my generation, my parents' generation for sure back, and even mine, because we're pre-internet days, coming up, in our young years. before that, things were completely different with sort of the guardrails that I was mentioning. Guardrails are all
Right.
off these days, and internet porn, I think it has the potential to be as addictive to women, especially young women, as to young men. And here's
Mm-hmm.
why I'm concluding that. Um, I'm the study that I think I shared with you last time about women and first sexual arousal, and
Yeah.
it affecting them, their earlier first sexual arousal affecting them more than it does boys and young men, as far as their future socio-sexuality.
I
And
think
for
that's
those that might,
huge. Yeah. Could you maybe give more details on that study? Because I was hoping you'd bring it up. Would you mind kind of going over
yeah,
it?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
The study found that first sexual arousal is important in forming female sexuality,
Yeah.
meaning that, and again, socio-sexuality, for somebody out there that might not know is basically the term for how willing you would be to have casual sex or be engaged in sexual activities, outside extramarital
Yeah.
sexual
Risky
activity.
sexual behaviors in general. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the study found that there is some effect, on boys, the age that they're exposed, but much more effect on the girls, at the age that they're first exposed, and sexual arousal occurs. So these days, with the average age being, probably even younger than this, but the last stats I saw was 10 to 13, first
Yeah.
exposure.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pre-puberty or right at puberty, and the um the fact that women are more, girls, females, let's say, are more influenced by when that happens than the males are. Up until now, we haven't had that situation. Even back in the days of my youth, where the pornography was Playboy and that type of thing,
Yeah.
you had to go to pretty good effort to, to get in touch with it, find it. Now it comes at our kids, just without them even trying. So
Yeah.
girls being exposed to it at younger ages, and then being more, other studies showing that they have more erotic plasticity than the boys do, as
Yeah.
far as how their sexuality is shaped easier at younger ages than the boys are. And just in general, females, women, are more malleable, in their how their sexuality forms and that type of
Yeah.
thing. So the exact process of porn, high speed internet porn that we're talking about, um, really, really, again, is makes it tough on, I think, girls and young women, because they get imprinted with these different things that they see, and they're really having their sexual conditioning take place. And what do we mean by sexual conditioning is, to put it in the vernacular, what turns them on,
Mm-hmm.
and they've found some of this interestingly in animal studies too, that with let's say rats, the things that first raise their dopamine levels really sharply, which is the physical indicator of
Yeah.
arousal. Um, Whatever they're around, whatever they're dealing with at that time, they'll imprint on that particular thing. And if it can be, an estrus, meaning in heat female, which is a normal thing, or it could be some other, like an object that they put in their cage, and then they raise their dopamine levels artificially highly, like
Mm-hmm.
porn would. And if there's a hammer in the cage, they will imprint on that, and they'll have a fetish, so to speak, for that. So
Mm.
um, most of the things that we deal with in our brains are very similar in their biochemistry to other animals, to animals, I should say. And rats are an easy one because they're easy to experiment on. So
Yeah.
so both that and the human research has shown that those young ages of exposure to these things, which is, unique in human history,
Yeah.
to your generation, really, maybe the one before it,
Yeah.
are what I think is causing this. So, and what it literally does is, watching porn starts molding the brain in a certain direction, and to certain tastes that girl that, normally would not develop the taste for that particular thing.
And do you mind if
And
I pause you there? Because I think this
yeah,
is a key observation for
sure.
our female listeners. What you're saying is that the earlier a woman is exposed, as a young girl, exposed to any sort of sexual behavior that causes arousal, right? The wider the socio-sexual template develops, you're talking about like bonding to different sexual behaviors, fetishes, like different things like that. I think that's huge because so much of pornography is deeply degrading and abusive towards women. I think there's some stat that like over 90% of pornography depicts some sort of verbal or physical humiliation of women. But so people usually question me on why would women consume it then? But so many of the women in our community were exposed to sexual behaviors through abuse. And it's in like an unfortunate human reality that you can experience arousal while being abused and therefore think that somehow you invited it. And many of our women endure that really painful experience. But I think this is key information for them that it makes sense that they would be bonded then to really degrading material because their first exposure was through, or first exposures, one of the first exposures was through a very degrading, humiliating, horrific circumstance. So I feel like that's just a key thing that I'm seeing that I think hopefully can help some of our listeners have compassion on themselves and their stories, because oftentimes it can feel it can be hard to see that link between why are we consuming the content we're consuming or doing the things we're doing. It's because we're bonded to an earlier experience of our exposure that was not our fault, but just physiologically changes our template and our composition. So I think that's a key observation for our listeners. I appreciate that information for them because that's huge. But continue. Sorry, you were talking about pornography changing.
No, don't be sorry. I agree.
Yeah.
That's a huge observation. And I think this kind of a conversation, we need to stop and make emphasize certain things.
Yeah,
because
pinpoint.
That is, I think, a huge insight, for a young woman to realize, wow, first of all, I'm the first or maybe the second generation, probably the first, to experience this kind of environment, this kind of sexualized environment. And so
constantly accessible.
My natural inherited genetic code doesn't match up, with this. It's what they call a super stimulus. And our brains don't know how to handle that, but they do handle it in the way you just described. They get bonded.
Yeah.
They get bonded to that experience. And then not only that, but the experience of watching porn is like a progressive type of a thing. So it not only raises dopamine, which is one of the explodes really dopamine in a lot of ways compared to what natural stimuluses would do.
Yeah.
But it also because it's shocking, a lot of it produces anxiety, and more so in females, I think. The research would show that more anxiety, more shame for watching it, or memories of the shame of what you're describing, some kind of abuse, that type of thing. It stimulates noradrenaline, adrenaline, and cortisol, and all of those, if you raise dopamine at the same time, it turns out in a very perverse way that it can be it can turn on a girl or young woman more than just typical or straight sex, and even loving sex as being portrayed would turn her on, because those again, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol. Yes, we think of them as, especially cortisol, as being negative, but it's exciting. It's exciting.
Yeah.
And it takes over brain circuits that are made to react to excitement. And so the combination of all of it, the arousal, the excitement, the shame, the anxiety, all of it mixed together is very, very arousing. And if a girl has had that experience early, then her brain's going to have a tendency to want to stay on that
and seek out those experiences. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's because their brain is molded in a way that's unnatural from the past. And it's like it's been kind of hijacked, basically, from underneath them, from what in the past, the normal progression of going along and on a farm, and you meet a boy when you're 15 or whatever, and you have attraction, but you're constrained in the whole situation by the form of courtship that they used back then.
Yeah.
That's much more the natural environment for, again, both sexes, but it's particularly women. Going back far enough, or 150 years, they had to kind of show up with a calling card, at the parents' house, and sit in the front room, for their dates. So comparing that to this, our brains weren't built for that. And literally, the again, the dopamine explodes and those other biochemicals that I talked about, and it starts setting down a template, like you said, setting down a template. And there is a there's a chemical that actually it's a protein that gets excreted. It's called delta phos B. Now we're going to get into some of the biochemistry of it.
Yeah.
And the delta phos B is a protein that starts literally molding the brain in the direction of that sexual stimulus. And it literally changes the brain's way that the genes are expressed. So it's a genetic transcription factor, they call it.
Yeah.
And so it starts sensitizing that person, in this case, a girl, young woman. It starts sensitizing her towards that type of stimulation. And so she gets very attentive to anything that would kind of bring that back. And it's kind of like you can picture it more with a alcoholic,
Yeah.
walking by a bar, hearing a bottle be opened, this, that, or the other. Well, same process. It's the same part of the brain. It's the nucleus accumbens, the reward center in the brain, and other parts, but mainly the nucleus accumbens. And so again, she just gets sexually conditioned for that. And so the delta phos B is making her more, as it builds up and it affects the cells around it and changes them, literally. It's causing her to be more sensitized and to crave that kind of stimulation. At the same time, this other chemical, another protein and another transcription factor, is also changing the molecular structure of the brain in the direction of needing more stimulation in order to get the same buzz, basically. So it's called CREB, C-amp response element binding protein. C-amp response element binding protein, CREB. And so it's kind of doing the other direction. So delta phos B is sensitizing her to that type of stimulation. And then CREB is causing her for it to less and less affect her, and for her to need more and more different kinds of stimulation, maybe more and more extreme, types of
absolutely
visuals and that type of thing. So again, that's the addiction process, and it works that way for porn or for again, morphine, heroin, cocaine, alcohol, you name it. But here's the thing that your listeners, Rachel, really need to know about, another important, I think, insight that we maybe need to emphasize. Those other addictions they're unnatural. The alcohol, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, you name it. They're unnatural. And on a population basis, biochemically, only about 10% of the people, male or female, who start them end up getting addicted to them. We think of things like heroin and all of it, cocaine, as being extremely addictive, but percentage-wise, only about 10% get addicted. That try it, get addicted to any of those, substances, type of things, because sex and food are natural reinforcers, and sex actually, sex to orgasm is the highest natural reinforcer or reward, basically. And again, because our ancestors, in some situations, particularly with males, like in a situation where they had the opportunity to have more than one wife, they were, mating with a lot of different women was a really highly rewarding thing to them as far as being able to produce more children. And so in our natures, in our system, we have a binge mechanism that overrides your normal again, people being able to walk away from it more easily. So both sex and then food is also another fits into that category. And if you think about it, our society is really awash in both junk food and junk sex, if you want to call them that way.
Yeah.
Because again, we're approaching 70%, of folks that are struggling with their, either they're obese or they're overweight, and it's because of the food binge overeating mechanism that allows people to overeat what they would normally would do, because in the past they needed to be able to eat a lot in order to make it through the next starving time. And then with the sex thing, it's the same thing with porn, especially porn, because it keeps giving you all these novel situations that are stimulating. Because again, novelty, especially for men, but also for women, we're finding now that novel sexual situations raise dopamine again, where the same thing wouldn't have. So to summarize that, you get about 10% or so of people who try those drugs of addiction to be eventually addicted. You're getting 40 to 50 to 60% at least, of the people who try porn for the first time becoming addicted to it. And again, same thing with food, but food and sex, I guess you'd say, they have the potential to addict almost everybody in the population. So that's why I think we're seeing the numbers, and why, even though it's a smaller percentage as far as females go with porn addiction, it's going up, and the numbers are big because it's a big percentage of the population.
Yeah, and it's a hijacking of a natural tendency. I think that's key information too.
Real quick, one other thing to add to that, with the men, it's easier to see because we're seeing it in erectile dysfunction rates.
Yeah.
Again, this study was done in Europe. They're ahead of us in all of this, if you can call it that, as far as exposures go. But let's say I think it was the UK, before 2002, only about 2 to 3% of men were experiencing, ED. And as a result, again, the internet has come about since 2002. They're experiencing 14 to 35% of their young men now having ED that are under 40. And again, that's unheard of, in world history, basically. So
that's unprecedented. Wow. Yeah. Because I think there's several things that you said that are just really sticking out to me. The first, and you said it several minutes ago, so I apologize for backtracking, but the fact that women have the potential to experience more anxiety and more shame through their porn consumption or other sexual compulsions, I think that's huge, because I've said that, and I actually regularly get criticized for saying that publicly, because I think I some men, rightly so, want to defend their experience, and I think at times maybe I've perhaps been a little bit insensitive to the experience of male shame, but I do objectively think women experience more shame in regards to porn consumption and other compulsions, because I didn't have the physiological reasons, but even from just a social or spiritual standpoint, I think that research holds really true, that there are just the spiritual and social expectations that cause women to isolate more, to experience higher levels of shame, because there are different expectations for women sexually than there are for men. So I just think that's a huge observation, that we actually physiologically experience more stress and shame in regards to these compulsions. But I also think talking about food and sex as the higher potential addictions, I think that's huge, because there's still an ongoing fight in the psychological world about whether or not sexual addiction is a valid term. And I think a lot of psychologists and clinicians avoid it because they are afraid of the opinion inhibiting human freedom. And the freedom to consume pornography, the freedom to, engage in risky sexual behavior, whatever you want to call it. But I think this information just really shows like, oh, actually, no, it doesn't just need to be labeled an addiction. It has the potential to be the most common one. And and I know there's been debate over whether or not you can get addicted to a behavior, but that is very clear. And eating would be a behavior too, because it's not the behavior itself you're getting addicted to. It's the dopamine levels the behavior produces. It's just like with drugs or alcohol.
I completely agree. And again, in past times, again, probably your generation being the first one to experience this because we've had high-speed internet porn for that much time. A huge percentage of, we already know, males highly addicted to it. I mean, in 2009, when they started trying to do the first internet porn related studies, and they jumped right on the males because of the things we talked about before, but they couldn't find any on these college campuses, anybody that wasn't using it to have a control group with. That's
oh my gosh.
that's how widespread it was, on the college campuses. And again, they haven't started going to the females until more recently, but yes, again, it makes sense because it's tapping into a natural reward system as opposed to these drugs that aren't, and they're hijacking it. But the sex and food is just applying a supernormal stimulus that's actually a natural stimulus for for our mind and body to generally take in and be benefited by if you're in a marriage relationship and building a family and doing all the things that they did in the past. So and the shame element, I totally agree. And a part of it, again, we keep in mind, again, ladies that might be listening to this, you are the more malleable, meaning changeable ones as far as your sexuality goes by what happens to your experiences as you grow up. That's just a fact. That's just a biological fact. The other thing is, as far as the shame part specifically, is not only what society has said to you, and then again the changing messages of society. The whole sex positive thing that to your earlier comment about the argument going on, oh, it's sex positive, and you're sex negative if you're against it. Well, again, if it's bad for you physically, health wise, I mean, I'd like to have that argument as far as, okay, what's sex positive and what's sex negative. So but the research, and in my area is really biology and physiology. That's where I come from. There are physiological studies showing that women's estrogen puts more stress on them, more anxiety on them for your typical, high socio-sexuality activities, and that would be porn would be included in that.
Yeah.
Just the estrogen itself, the estrogen's effect on the brain creates more constraint. Now, again, that's generally in women than it does in men. I say generally because another big element that maybe for another day, a full-blown talk about it, that affects all this is that women particularly, there's kind of a couple different types of women, and it depends on what's happened to that little baby girl in utero as far as the hormone exposure and how her brain has been organized. In a pretty small, like 10 to 20% of women, their brains have been, for different reasons, exposed to higher levels of testosterone in utero, and they'll have a higher tendency, because their brains are formed a little bit differently than your typical woman, to sexual stimuli. They'll react more in a male typical way. So we have a little variabilities and different variables going on here, but in general, I think your typical 80% of women in this environment, this culture that we're in, they come out of this whole thing feeling really, like you said, shamed and anxiety and that type of thing for something, as you said earlier, that really isn't their fault. They've just been born into this unnatural environment, and things are being pushed on them, in a lot of cases by some of the scientists, so-called scientists, because I don't think that an actual genuine scientist would push sexual anarchy on people and call it sex positive and try to make the case that it's healthy, because we have way too much evidence that it isn't. And to your earlier comment, just to reinforce what you were saying about drug addictions versus behavioral addictions, I can tell you it's exactly the same process in the brain and the same result. The delta phos-B and the Krebs. Same thing happens with substances, the same process, and the same thing happens with behavior, in this case porn. So yeah, there's no doubt, again, with the brain scans and the different ways that we have of testing for this, there's no doubt that it's either behavior or substance is still a legitimate addiction.
Yeah,
so
that's huge.
I'll leave that at that. But one other thing I want to just add in here real quick is that along the lines of what you're talking about, Rachel, with women feeling anxiety and shame and for doing the same thing that maybe some boys and young men are not feeling so much anxiety and shame, they're also given messages from the porn, both the young men and young women and boys and girls, about sexuality that are false messages, and it's making girls and young women have to conform to practices, because the young people are watching these practices like anal sex and like rough sex and like oral sex and all these different things that not that some of that, and oral sex might be a fairly normal thing, but they're being asked to perform these types of acts even within marriages, because they've seen it on the porn films. And scary thing, but 53% of boys and 39% of girls believe that porn realistically portrays sex, that porn is the way terrifying. That sex should take place. And so I think especially for girls and women, this whole, again, having kind of this built-in estrogen constraint system, and then also what they've been taught about, hey, don't be a whore, and then this, that, and the other, where those messages aren't given to the males. You're a stud, if you're able to have sex with a bunch of women. So there's a couple things conflicting there and making it tougher on the women. And so I completely see, and I saw this with the college women I was working with. They were caught between a rock and a hard place, in the hookup culture situation. So I completely get it, and maybe that's why. Again, my life has gone in this direction, that I work mostly with women on these issues. Is I completely get the biochemistry of it, the brain architecture element, and also the societal element to it. So, I'll stop there. What are your thoughts about that?
I think, I remember doing similar research for my book on just how porn affects our perception of our not just our sexuality, but I think women bear the weight of body image dissatisfaction because of it as well. And we've actually done a few things like blog posts and podcast episodes on body image dissatisfaction in Magdala, because there's some interesting research linking eating disorders or body dysmorphia to porn consumption or other sexual behaviors, hookup culture in general. It's created not just an idea of how sex between men and women go, or women and women, or men and men, or whoever, but how women should look. It's created a very unrealistic template for how women should look as well. And I think, and for men too, but I think women bear the weight of that far more because their bodies tend to be far more featured in pornography. So I think it's created a very, very difficult ideal to uphold. And then pressures are put on them in relationships, like you're saying, even in marriages, to perform a certain way, to look a certain way that real women just don't look, and real women just don't act. And so it is just a really horrific kind of tragedy that we're living right now, and that we're striving to help women get out of for themselves and for the sake of their relationships, if they have them. But I think that's just huge, the information there of just that this is creating a disordered perception of sexuality in the body, not in just the immediate, but in long term. And it's a scary stat that young men and women think that porn is realistic. I think you said 53% of men. That's half of men. That's really frightening. But hopefully we'll get that number lower and lower. We have to start to wrap up, unfortunately, because I think, again, we could record for hours on this or record several episodes, which is what we'll intend to do, I think. But I'd love to hear your advice for perhaps, you know, a woman, or we have some male listeners as well, who listen to this information and get a little discouraged. You know, they've been addicted for several years. They're discouraged at hearing that the biochemistry of their brain has changed. What would you suggest for somebody who wants to begin reversing that process? And what does reversing that process look like, even physiologically?
Yeah, well, it is discouraging, and it can be overwhelming and daunting. Yeah. But the good news is that the mind and body do repair themselves, given a chance. And it turns out to be the same as for, you know, your classic alcohol addiction or your heroin addiction or whatever. It's abstinence. You have to practice abstinence, and given a certain amount of time, and it's, you know, it's not that long. You know, it's the classic thing for alcohol, it would be like 30 days or whatever to get started, but that's just the start of it. But there's a good book called Dopamine Nation, and really what a lot of this comes down to is the way it blasts our dopamine, any of these different stimulants that we're talking about, and it causes the receptors in our brains for about a week after, let's say, a porn and then masturbation session to orgasm. It shrinks. It literally shrinks the dopamine, the cells that secrete dopamine in the brain. So, and when you're doing it often, you know, throughout the week, you're just really making those dopamine receptors go away, basically. And so it takes a ton of dopamine stimulation to get anywhere with your brain. Dopamine Nation, the professor that wrote it is a Stanford professor, and I think she's very
Dopamine Nation. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And Anna Lemke, again, she writes the book, as you know, since you have it, around her addiction to, I guess you'd say, like the Twilight series of
erotica, written pornography.
Yeah, and erotica, basically. And you just have to go away from it. You have to abstain from it, and your mind and body will repair themselves. And again, if you're a Christian of some type, even other world religions, or particularly a Catholic, you know, with the Catholic beliefs, it's just practicing the sacraments and getting your brain in another place and kind of living sacrificially for a while, because again, given the time, the brain will repair itself, and you'll have a normal dopamine response to things that you should, like being around your family, you know, having a nice meal, exercising, especially if you're used to exercising, the different things, being in a nice sunny day outside. Those are the things that your mind and body are supposed to react to with dopamine rewards. But on any kind of addiction, in our case, we're talking about porn, it just dulls all those things and makes none of that rewarding anymore. And one other, again, point to emphasize here: anytime a stimulus is easily available, it has a much higher potential for addicting people. They say, you know, that people generally talk down on prohibition when they prohibited alcohol in the 1920s and into the early 1930s, but they cut down on alcoholism by 50%. So people were getting it, buying out the black market, that type of thing, but 50% of the people that were addicted or potentially would have been addicted didn't get addicted. So what I would advise is make it difficult for yourself to access porn. So that literally you go away from it, you walk away, and you never look back, because it's like alcohol addiction. You know, you can be an alcoholic, and again, that delta phos B, the changes that it makes in your brain, where you're sensitized to it, you're gonna be sensitized to it for a long time. So you want to, again, avoid it, and given a month, 2 months, 3 months, something around that time frame, you're going to be a whole new person as far as far as it controlling you. You know, again, the sex positive thing that people say, and it frees you and that type of thing. It enslaves us, basically. So, I mean, I've struggled. I used to struggle with it, myself, and I was just thinking, okay, I'd rationalize. It's just pixels, on the screen. It's nothing real and that type of thing. But the changes, as you said earlier, the dopamine change, especially blast that it gives us, that's what's going on. I mean, again, it doesn't matter if it's pixels or whether you're with a real person, and that type of thing. It's not disordered, as you said. Disordered sexuality is what it is. So I think it's very encouraging to know that if we make it very, very difficult for us to access it and just don't access it for long enough, we're going to get back to normal. And then again, we have to pour ourselves into the sacraments and into all the different ways that we have, all the different access points to help, like confession, mass. And if you're not a Catholic, you're listening to this, church in general, that you're attending, and being around people that are like-minded, and also realize the danger of that it poses to us. And in a lot of cases, I would say try to be around people that maybe have walked away from it themselves. Like Magdala. I mean, Magdala is a great example of that. So important as a support group for the others that everything that we do is easier if we do it in a team, in a family type of a thing. And the need for sexual integrity right now in our sexually confused society has never been greater. It's never been more of a premium on it, I would say. So it's one of the most important things we can do for everybody, for ourselves first, for our mate if we're married, our kids if we have kids, grandkids in our case. Because sexual integrity, it has a healing effect, and it will heal people, on the physical level, yes, but more importantly on the emotional and mental level, and spiritual even, basically.
Absolutely. So. Well said. I think that's a beautiful conclusion. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Joe. You will be back. And for our listeners, as always, if you are a woman who is struggling with a sexual addiction or compulsion, you can join a group at the link below. If you're a woman who has experienced healing and recovery from a sexual addiction or compulsion, you can also sign up to become a small group leader. We currently have a wait list that's getting pretty long, so we are actively recruiting new small group leaders. So if you feel so called, please reach out for more information on leading a group. If you would like to support Magdala while also receiving more exclusive content, please join our Patreon. We have an awesome community building on Patreon. You get access to exclusive podcast episodes, blog posts, and also book studies. And our book study that's starting in the fall, I'm not sure when this episode is going to be released, but our book study starting in the fall is on my book, Love and Recovery. My team members will be leading an awesome book study with our Patreon community on it. And if you're a patron, you also get access to our Slack, which is just basically one massive group chat on multiple topics with members of our community. If you would like to support Magdala another way, you can always consider becoming a donor. Each of our donors makes our work possible. We are serving women in 36 countries and counting, and our donors are a huge, huge part of that mission. So thank you to all of our donors. And if you'd like to support Magdala, please consider becoming a donor. If you need access to Covenant Eyes and would like to try it as a software for accountability as you're recovering, you can use the code Magdala for 30 days free. If you want to get rid of your smartphone for a time, we are a Light Phone affiliate as well, so you can find the code below. That's a lot of information. Thanks for taking in that fire hose. And as always, we will catch you soon, and our prayers are with you. God bless.